Hi folks, first off, apologies for the long wait for this one. It's been a very busy couple of months. I became a father, which is a lot of fun. I had a little boy, his name is Hugo, he's adorable, but naturally somewhat more time consuming. On top of that, I've been working on several history projects, including a wonderful poetry project with several schools for the National Famine Memorial here in Ireland. Shout out to Scoil Owen Bostia, Carrigart, Scoilwara Milford, Scoilwara Creasla, and Creasla National School, Creasla. If you want to incentivize me to make these videos more full-time, then please support me on Patreon. The more I can make there, the less I have to supplement it with so many other projects. You can support these videos at patreon.com/John D Ruddy. And now, just in time for Charlie's Magic Blood Fancy Hat Party, here is Monarchs of England Part 4. That was a Coronation reference for anyone watching in the future going, what? Manny Man does history. The House of Anjou, later named Plantagenet, had been ruling England for hundreds of years. A long rivalry existed between England and France, fighting over territory on the mainland. Attempting to join their houses and create a lasting peace, King Philip IV of France married his daughter Isabella off to the English King Edward II, resulting in their son King Edward III of England. The French crown was not allowed to be inherited through a woman. None of Philip's sons had sons to continue the line, so the French crown passed across to a cousin, Philip VI, despite Edward III of England being a direct grandson of Philip IV, albeit through his mother. The new King Philip VI confiscated England's Duchy of Aquitaine. Rather than trying to negotiate, Edward straight up laid claim to the French throne. This would begin what would become the 100 Years' War between England and France. Because France and Scotland were allies, Edward needed to be careful not to start a fight on two fronts. To soften up the barons, Edward promoted the idea of chivalry and knighthood, harkening back to the old stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Edward created several new earls and created the title of Duke for close royal family members. His son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, became the first royal duke. These duchies would ensure independent wealth for the royal family. Yay. Edward became one of the first English monarchs to favour Windsor Castle as a residence, having been born there himself. In the war with France, English ships managed to secure the English Channel against the French, but already military costs were building up and people at home weren't happy. Edward quartered the royal coat of arms, adding the French fleur-de-lis to further hammer home his claim to France. The English Parliament at this time was beginning to diverge into the House of Lords and House of Commons. Edward initially sent forces to the politically unstable Brittany, gaining some territory, but nothing too advantageous. At the same time, the king defaulted on his debts to two Florentine families, causing them to go bankrupt. Cool. The war cranked up a gear in 1346 when Edward led an army across to Normandy, sacking Caen and defeating Philip VI's forces at Crécy. At the same time, Scotland invaded England. But the Scottish King David II was captured in battle, which spurred Edward to lay siege to Calais for 11 months, securing the closest crossing point to England. But then the Black Death came to England and the war was put on hold. The bubonic plague wiped out a third of Europe's population and indeed a massive portion of the workforce. England suffered from labour shortages, so the peasants who survived would get paid more for their valuable labour. But Edward and the Parliament brought in labour laws to fix wages to pre-plague levels. Landlords competed with each other for labourers, causing some places to fill with workers and other places, often the smaller farmers, to be left with nothing. With more people being forced to move from town to town, surnames became more prominent in society, needing to differentiate between 15 different Johns. During this time, the Pope was actually based in Avignon, not Rome, and many English people were annoyed that they felt that their taxes to the Pope were going to France, their enemy. Edward limited the papacy's influence on English court, but the tie would not be completely severed, at least not for another couple of hundred years. Edward also gave more power to justices to fight crime. Cool. He created the Order of the Garter, again to promote chivalry, and made St. George the patron saint of England. The Combat of the 30 was an example of chivalry of the time, as a 30-a-side duel to decide control of the Duchy of Brittany. As the years went on, Edward promoted a sense of national unity, giving more protection to the English language, although most of court still spoke French. Edward's son and heir, Edward of Woodstock, led a force back to France, winning victories, territory, and capturing the French king. This led to a peace treaty securing English territory in Aquitaine, initially having Edward renounce his claim to the French throne. Prince Edward would gain the reputation as a fierce, chivalrous knight, gaining the nickname the Black Prince. In Ireland, the Anglo-Normans, who had been living there for almost 200 years now, had really bought into the Irish language and Irish culture, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, and many had already been distancing themselves from ties with England. Fearing they would set up their own independent Hiberno-Norman kingdom themselves, Edward's son Lionel brought in the Statutes of Kilkenny to ban Irish culture amongst the Normans in Ireland. It wasn't too effective, as they could barely enforce it. Edward the Black Prince briefly got involved in a civil war in Castile, but to no avail. With a new French king, war in France stirred up again. Edward, now an old man, sent his son John of Gaunt to lead, and after a long, miserable march across France, they left with little fight, and England's lands on the mainland were reduced to Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne, and left the southern English coast open to French raids. The House of Commons made progress in power, complaining about corruption and having certain of the king's higher-ups expelled, including Edward's mistress Alice Perrers. That same year, Edward the Black Prince had fallen ill and died of dysentery at the age of 45. At this time, his father, the king, became ill and would die of a stroke less than a year later, ending a long 50-year reign. Edward III's grandson and son of Edward the Black Prince, 10-year-old Richard II became king. Richard II's early rule was overseen by various councils, with his uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock trying to gain influence over the boy king, but Richard surrounded himself with friends and advisors he trusted. The system for peasants at the time was serfdom, where peasants were bound to work for a lord and land, not free to work wherever they want. Still feeling the long after effects of the Black Death, subsequent outbreaks, and a new poll tax, which was often violently collected from the poor, the peasants in the southeast had had enough and rose up in revolt against the establishment, against John of Gaunt, demanding an end to serfdom. Richard, now aged 14, went out to Mile End and met with the peasants and their leader, Wat Tyler, to negotiate, promising massive changes to the system. At the same time, more peasants stormed the Tower of London as its gates lay open, executing many nobles for their greed, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, the King's Chancellor and most hated tax collector. They also went after foreigners, mainly the Flemish. Yay, xenophobia. The next day, the king met with the peasants again at Smithfield, only for the Lord Mayor of London to stab the rebel leader Wat Tyler. Richard was still able to show great leadership, demanding the peasants follow him, only for them to round up the rebels and publicly execute the dying Wat Tyler, killing the rebellion. Richard went on to have many of the rebel leaders hunted down and brutally executed, sending a message to the people. Richard learned the importance of strength in his rule. At this time, the situation with the Pope in Avignon had complicated even further into another Pope in Rome, again leading different kingdoms across Europe, siding with different popes, known as the Western Schism. Richard married Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, to show his support for the Roman Pope. Of course, many of Richard's court did not like this match. Richard sent a crusade force to take Flanders, and it failed. So he personally took a force to invade Scotland, and it failed. He was getting on less and less with his uncle, John of Gaunt, who eventually went off to try and claim the throne of Castile. With the threat of France looming, Richard's Chancellor approached the House of Commons to raise taxes to defend the kingdom. They ultimately forced the king to remove the Chancellor and reevaluate the taxes. Richard did not like having his kingly powers challenged like this. He toured the country to gain the support of his people and began organising a private military force for his own protection. When he returned to London, he was met by several lords who were conspiring against him, and using the Parliament, they managed to exile and execute many of Richard's closest allies and councillors, and pushed for more aggression against France. Richard was furious, but he would play the long game. He gradually took control of the Parliament and, using a different tactic, moved for peace with France, promising to reduce taxes. Over the years, peace talks with France would ensue, and sadly, Richard's wife, Anne, died of plague. Richard took a force of 8,000 troops to Ireland to reinforce the loyal Anglo-Norman lords and got several Irish chieftains to submit to English lordship. Yay! Richard was a devout Catholic and big into the veneration of Edward the Confessor, adding Edward's coat of arms to his own royal crest. Through a truce with France, he married the 6-year-old French Princess Isabella. 6. Though his peace with France promised to reduce taxes, Richard's lavish life at court and patronising the arts ended up being just as expensive. Oops. With Richard now confident in his rule, he had those lords who'd went against him arrested, some killed, others exiled. At the Parliament of Shrewsbury, Richard declared himself absolute ruler with the Parliament's power, becoming a committee of 12 lords and 6 commoners chosen by the king. His court became a place to venerate the absolute monarch, calling him his royal majesty, surrounded by his own private army of bodyguards. Richard had exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, who had been one of the Lords Appellant. When John died, Richard disinherited Henry and dispersed his estates. Henry was not impressed. Richard travelled with most of his loyal supporters on another expedition to Ireland. No English monarch would travel to Ireland for another 300 years. While Richard was away, Henry returned to England, meeting little resistance and gaining loads of support from those wronged by King Richard. When Richard returned through Wales, he was confronted by Henry and quickly surrendered to him. He was taken back to London, where he gave up the crown to his cousin Henry, even though Henry wasn't even next in line. Richard II would be the last king of the Plantagenet House of Anjou. Henry was descended of Edward III's son John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and so this royal line of Plantagenet would be known as the House of Lancaster. King Henry IV allowed Richard to live, until he realised that having a living deposed king always ran the risk of him being restored later. So Richard was ultimately starved to death in Pontefract Castle. Or Richard starved himself, who's to know? Henry IV was the first king of England since the Norman invasion whose first language was English. All the Norman kings of England up until that point had French as their first language. Henry bound the Duchy of Lancaster to the crown itself, becoming a lucrative income for the crown to this day. I see you, Charlie. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Palaiologos was hosted by Henry for a time, looking for aid for the fading empire, the only Byzantine emperor to visit England. Henry consulted Parliament on the burning of religious heretics, which he proceeded to do. Given that technically he'd not been the first in line for the throne, Henry faced many plots and rebellions. After a border dispute, Welshman Owen Glendower was proclaimed Prince of Wales. The English response was penal laws to punish the Welsh and limit them from basically doing anything. The Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and his son, Henry Hotspur, led a rebellion against Henry IV, but Henry IV's son, Henry of Monmouth, led the Crown's forces to victory at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Henry was certainly a popular name. The young Henry of Monmouth was nearly killed in the battle, taking an arrow to the face. But after the best medical treatment available to the young heir to the throne, he survived. Owen Glendower gained more support and even got some international recognition for Wales. He plotted with Henry's enemies, but over time the English blockaded Wales using the vast network of castles, and Glendower was forced to head for the hills, where he would later die. English pirates captured the heir to the Scottish throne while en route to France. Future James I of Scotland was captured by English pirates and delivered to Henry. The future James I of Scotland was delivered to Henry, where the 11-year-old was held captive for 18 years. Later, Parliament would suggest confiscating church land, but Henry was reluctant to fully go against the might of the church. Henry IV's later reign would be marred by very poor health. His son Henry of Monmouth became more involved in the government at this time, though political differences between father and son would have young Henry dismissed from the council. As the years went on, persistent rumours of the secret survival of Richard II gained traction, and the Scottish began claiming he was alive and well in the Scottish court, trying to further destabilise England. Henry IV would later die at the age of 45, leaving his son Henry of Monmouth to become Henry V, the new king. With so many descendants of Edward III in such powerful positions, along with Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II, there was fertile ground for plots and rival cousins to sow discontent. However, Henry V sought to unite the country once more, honourably reinterring Richard II's remains in Westminster Abbey, and restoring titles and estates to those who suffered under the previous two rival kings. As much as the 100 Years' War was called so, it was not a constant war between France and England, with periods of peace between what's known as the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, and the Lancastrian War. Henry IV's reign had seen relative peace with France, but now with a united England, without major internal squabbles, Henry V took up his grandfather's claim to the French throne and set sail for France with an army. He laid siege to Harfleur and then marched on Calais, being intercepted by a much bigger French army. They fought on the plains of Agincourt, and the outnumbered English soldiers managed to win a crippling victory over the bogged-down French soldiers. As the French prisoners from the battle outnumbered the entire English force, Henry ordered the prisoners executed. England were in a powerful position, with France almost at their mercy. The 100 Years' War would rage on for decades, with the seeds of discontent growing back home in England, growing into thorny roses. But all of this will be in the next part of Monarchs of England, where I'll finish up the 100 Years' War and begin the Wars of the Roses. I had hoped to encapsulate the 100 Years' War in this video, but I wanted to get it. I wanted to have at least some of it finished for the coronation, and it just kept going. It just kept going. But definitely next one. I got as far as Agincourt. I was like, cool. I got as far as Agincourt. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when the next video comes up. Please consider supporting this channel on patreon.com/John D Ruddy. It really helps with the ongoing production of these videos. Be sure to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and TikTok for daily history posts and updates. Thank you so much for watching.